So today we're going to talk about trauma. So what it looks like, why it happens. We're going to talk about signs. We're going to look at some strategies so that we can have safe discussions for people that we might be supporting. And we're going to wrap this up by talking about self-care and how important it is as we're supporting other people, but also looking after ourselves. So when I first spoke to Catherine and Miguel about this workshop and what they wanted to offer, they talked about conversations that you as caregivers, as parents, might experience when you are working with staff, when you are working with friends, family, your children. And this conversation about trauma, what trauma looks like, how people are traumatized, how to support people, these sorts of questions came up. So I've put together something that talks about, like I said, on a very simple level of what trauma is. But I thought I would start with this slide, and this slide essentially says it all. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic event is going to be traumatized. Why I am saying this is because I want us to remember that we are human beings, and human beings, we are built to feel. We are built to feel sad. We are built to feel down. We are built to feel angry and all sorts of other experiences. I also want to stress that everyone here, including myself and Miguel, we experience stress on a regular basis. And our bodies are actually built to know what to do when we're experiencing stress. And when we experience traumatic situations, and they can range from an argument to moving to a new country to violence, it really depends. We all experience this event differently. And there are a number of reasons why. Number one, we're all built differently. We're not cars, we're not built on an assembly line. Number two, genetic factors. Number three, supports. We all have different supports. Some people don't have supports at all. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of these things, but I wanted to start off by reminding everyone that we all experience trauma in some way, shape, or form. Something that is considered a traumatic event is something like a car accident. There are two people who may be in the same car accident, but experience the accident in different ways. Yes, someone mentioned past experiences, absolutely. So to add on to what I just said, I wanted to talk about acute stress, because a lot of the times when I have conversations in the community, I hear this word PTSD thrown around, and I actually hear people joke about it as well. They'll say something like, oh, don't do that because I'm going to experience PTSD. Now, PTSD, I'm going to get to in a second. It's post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder happens after a traumatic event. But what a lot of people don't know is that PTSD kind of comes later. What happens initially within the first 4 weeks of a traumatic event is something called acute stress. Acute stress happens within the first 30 days. After the incident, people may experience that anxiety, that intense fear, feeling helpless, wanting to isolate or even avoid situations. They also may have flashbacks or dreams or thoughts that bring them back to the event. Now, if I can use a very simple example, would be a car accident. I'm going to go back to person A and person B. If person A and person B were in the same car accident, and person A, after the car accident, went home and had a partner that they were able to speak to, and person B went home and they were alone because they lived on their own. I want you to imagine person A maybe going to see their doctor the next morning, and person B not going to the doctor at all. Then person A decides they're going to talk to somebody about their experience, and person B does not. So both people, A and B, have experienced the car accident. Person A is getting some supports, partner, doctor, therapy. Person B did not receive any supports, and person B is more likely to experience that PTSD if they're not looking after themselves, especially within those 4 weeks of the traumatic event. Okay, now if someone is not getting the support that they need, they're not getting counseling, they're not going to see their doctor, they're not talking about it, that can turn into something called post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder is considered a mental illness. Is it something that people live with for the rest of their lives? Not necessarily. So when we take a look at what trauma is, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It's an experience that overwhelms our ability to cope. Okay, so I'm gonna get you to use the chat box here because I can already tell you love to participate. Let's talk about some traumatic experiences that one person can experience in their lifetime. All right, so sexual assault, losing a parent, witness death of a family member. What else? Those are a few. I want you to think about, and there you go, Zainab. That was exactly going to come out of my mouth. Separation, divorce, relationship breakups, abusive parents. I'm going to say abuse at all, verbal abuse, physical abuse, domestic abuse. Very good. Accidents, car accidents, airplane accidents. Yes, narcissistic abuse for sure. So any of these things can cause trauma. Substance abuse in parents, question mark? Absolutely. If you have parents who are living with a substance use disorder, absolutely, that can be traumatic experience for us, especially depending on what we're seeing and what we're experiencing. Oh, that's a good one, Pamela. Birth trauma, tough medical procedures. I'm going to add to that, Danny, and I'm going to say things like illness, physical illness, like cancer, like any sort of illness that we are dealing with. People who are living with a disability, for example, because of a car accident. So you're right on the money. Everything that you've listed here can be a traumatic event, but all of these events do not necessarily equal PTSD. So let's talk about the types of trauma. And these are the basic, like I said, Cole's Notes version of what trauma is. So we have three main types. The first one is primary trauma. And primary trauma is trauma that we experience personally. So if my parents went through a divorce, that's something that I would experience. If I was in a car accident, that is something that I would experience personally. Then we have secondary trauma. And this is trauma that happens through other people. So I want you to think about stories that you've heard. I want you to think about maybe talking to your child, to your best friend, to your partner, to somebody that you work with. And I want you to think about stories that people share with us. I also want you to think about stories you've shared with other people. Sometimes people share things with us and the information that they give us is so visual that it sticks with us. And that trauma is considered secondary trauma. Now, if you're doing this for a living, meaning you are supporting people and you are a caregiver, you may have experienced primary trauma and then secondary trauma from supporting others. So Charlotte, great question. Intergenerational trauma, yes. So there are all sorts of other types of trauma, but we're not going to discuss this in this event because that is a more detailed and clinical presentation that we can offer in the future. But yes, that is a type of trauma when we dig deeper. And intergenerational trauma can be that primary and secondary, and also vicarious. Vicarious trauma is an accumulation of primary and secondary trauma. So if you can imagine, as a caregiver, like I said, you've experienced something yourself, and then you are supporting people every day, all day. All of this stuff, all of these feelings start to pile up. And sometimes it can lead to PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, before I go on to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about mental health and mental illness or mental disorders. They mean the same thing. We've been talking a lot about mental health. I mean, me personally, for the past 12 years. And I remember when I started at CMHA 12 years ago, I remember thinking, wow, this is going to be great. This is going to be big. And I really have seen a shift in the past decade. When I first started delivering presentations, I can honestly say that it was very quiet. People didn't talk about it more. And even the language has shifted, which has been nice. Today, we are talking about it. Today, I am out and in the community talking to schools, a lot of businesses and corporations, getting individuals like myself in there to talk about what mental health is and how they can support their staff, their clients, their children, their families. When we think about mental health, I want you to remember that everyone has mental health. Some days are good and some days are not so good. When our not so good days, however, turn into weeks or months, it can turn into an illness. And when we take a look at what a mental illness is, in a nutshell, it's a change in behavior that's consistent and it affects the person's day-to-day living. So when we think about PTSD, and I just shared with you that it's a mental illness, it's considered a mental illness, think about these symptoms someone may be having. And the question is, are these symptoms, are these behaviors consistent, and are they affecting the way this person lives their day-to-day life? If the answer is yes, then it's possibly PTSD. So like I mentioned, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition. It's triggered by a terrifying event. The person may experience it themselves or they may witness it. The important thing for us is to remember that a lot of the times we can get through, we can move past a terrifying experience, but we need those supports along the way. We're talking about self-care, we're talking about therapy, talking about it. I can share with you that when I was 18, I was involved in a car accident. Miguel, I don't even think you know this. I was involved in a car accident. There were 4 of us in the car, and my friend Ivan passed away. And it was a very terrifying event, but it wasn't to me. And I'll tell you why. Because I was knocked out. I didn't see anything. When I woke up in the hospital, people had to tell me what had happened. And I can say, when my cousin who was in the car with me started to share some of the things that happened, and it was pretty bad, I started to feel things, but I couldn't remember anything because I was knocked out. So like I said, PTSD can happen if the acute stress isn't looked after. And if these symptoms get worse, they last for months, even years with some individuals, it is possible that you would receive a diagnosis of PTSD. So what trauma looks like? I will say also that everyone experiences it differently. These are some of the more common things that we notice. This inability to experience positive emotions, feeling numb, having recurring images, having those thoughts, having nightmares or flashbacks, feeling like you are reliving the event. Sometimes people are avoiding people, places, conversations. And also, for me, what happened after that car accident, even though I didn't remember a thing, over time, little things came to me via people's stories, because everyone who was involved shared their version of what happened. I started to avoid certain roads, and I did not let anybody else drive for a very long time. I preferred being in the driver's seat because I had that control. Years and years later, now this is before I became a mental health educator, I didn't deal with any of my emotions. I didn't speak to anybody about it. But in my 30s, I started talking to somebody, and this stuff came up. And it definitely has helped me work through some of those feelings of, that control, having the control, letting other people drive, these sorts of things. Sometimes people also feel tense, on guard, easily startled. It's important also to remember that if someone's experiencing trauma or these symptoms, they may not experience everything on the list. So I mentioned stress. I talked about everyone experiencing stress. What I can add to that is when we think about our reactions to stress, our reactions are typically about our perceptions to the threat, not the actual stressful situation in itself. So oftentimes when we are experiencing stress, for whatever reason, there is a part of our brain that shuts down. And this is where we can go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And I'm not talking about trauma right now. I'm talking about our reactions to stress. So sometimes when we are stressed, we fight. We literally fight, right? We talk back, we answer back, we have to have the last say. Some people physically fight, argue with each other because we perceive there is a threat. Sometimes we freeze. And this is where our brain shuts off entirely. We're not sure what to say. We're not sure what to do. This happens to me sometimes, and it can be so frustrating where, a half an hour after a conversation, I think of things I could have said. That is typically when I know that that experience was stressful for me. And then, so we got freeze, we have fight, and then we have flight. Sometimes when we're in stressful situations, we flight, we avoid situations. And I am going to say that there are situations where flighting is actually not a bad idea. Sometimes when you are in the thick of an argument or something that's very tense, avoiding that situation, taking a break from that situation is actually going to help us have a better conversation later. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can support someone who might be experiencing trauma. So I want you to think about this based on what we've talked about so far, and based on everything that you listed in the chat. I think it's fair to say that everyone at some point in their life is going to experience something that may be traumatic, right? I'm going to go back to some of the things that you've listed. So losing someone, medical illness, birth, substance use or abuse, domestic violence, car accidents, separation, divorce, a death in the family, losing a parent. There's a lot of things here that we may have already experienced in our lifetime. So what I'm going to say is, before we support anyone, I want us to remember, or try to remember, to take a step back and maybe even assume that everyone has been in uncomfortable situations in their lifetime. I also want us to remember, and I know we've been talking about this for the last couple of years since COVID, this idea of showing empathy. Empathy is not necessarily putting yourself in someone's shoes. Empathy to me is more like being present when the person is speaking and trying to connect with what that person is saying. Because we may not 100% know what a person is going through because we may have never experienced what they have experienced. But if someone is telling me that they feel angry, oh, I can relate to that. If someone tells me that they are feeling sad, I can relate to that. Many times people's feelings, people's thoughts and emotions are very similar to things or feelings that we have experienced before. So to add to that, a couple of things I want to mention. So number one here is building trusting relationships, right? So when we build a trusting relationship, people feel more inclined to accept help, to accept resources that are available to them. I also, this is not in here, but I want to mention it because I just thought of it right now. I want to talk about the idea of a warm transfer. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this term before, but essentially a warm transfer is making that connection between a person who is distressed or upset to a service provider. So oftentimes, here's what happens. You are supporting Bob, who is right in front of you, and Bob has been experiencing a situation. He shares with you the situation. You have spent a lot of time listening to Bob and his experience. You want to help. You want to help some more. And so you dig through your desk and you pass Bob a phone number and you say, I've heard about this great organization. You should give them a call. Okay. And this is great. It's great that you know this information. It's great that you're passing it on. But here's what happens. A lot of the times, people get this pamphlet that you're giving them and they lose it or they throw it away or it gets stuck in a drawer sometimes and then eventually they throw it out. What a warm transfer is actually connecting that person to the service. So if I'm talking to Bob and together we decide that Bob should maybe reach out to an organization like Erin Mills Connects, I might call someone at Erin Mills Connects, or if it's a crisis line, I might call the crisis line with Bob beside me and do that formal introduction. Hi, my name's Tammy. I'm with my friend Bob here. Bob is experiencing a difficult time right now, and I wanted to connect him to your services because I've used your services or I heard of your services. And I want him to know that if and when I'm not available, there's somebody else that can help. So this is what a warm transfer is. And you can use this for crisis lines. You can use this for any sort of organization out there. The next thing on this list is giving a sense of control. And essentially, when we're talking to someone who may have experienced a traumatic event, a lot of the times these traumatic experiences are out of their control, right? If we go back to something like a car accident happened. It's out of your control. But when you're supporting someone, you can give them control back by asking open-ended questions, by showing them you are an active listener. You also want to consider the next step here, which is offering choices. So again, if I go back to Bob and I'm supporting Bob, I might mention Erin Mills Connects. I might mention CMHA. I might mention a crisis line. I might mention the hospital. Giving Bob some choice is going to help Bob, going back to that control, pick and choose what they feel they need at that time. And that's not to say that he won't pick up the other things later on. I also want us to think about a couple of these things that I've learned. So the first thing up there is being empathetic. I am sure you have heard the saying that most people listen with the intent to respond. A lot of times when we are sharing with other people, people are not actively listening. They are just thinking of some clever thing to say back. And when you are on the receiving end, that can be very frustrating. That can be very annoying. And you know what? It can really make the person feel like their problems aren't that important to you. So being an empathetic listener, like I said, is about being present and trying to relate to the feelings that they're having. Compassion goes a long way, actively listening, also thinking about being flexible. And you know what? That can mean a lot of things. Flexibility could mean, hey, I'd like to go for a walk instead of, being in the office and talking. Flexible might also be, times, dates, things like this. If you're supporting someone, this individual needs to know that you value their experience. I want us to remember, as adults, as caregivers, we've experienced a lot ourselves. And sometimes all of the experience that we bring to the table can cause us to have judgment. And I'm going to say that we all do it, even the best of us that try not to. We all can judge people and their experiences. And when we're judging, when we're making assumptions, we're not really valuing a person's experience. Collaboration is in there as well, because when we are supporting someone who's experiencing something traumatic, they may be leading the conversation, but there may be times where you are leading the conversation. And hopefully there are times where you can collaborate on ideas that can help the person move forward. When you're supporting someone as well, you really have to be comfortable with the unknown. Because when we're talking about trauma and when we're in a position to listen, people may throw anything on our plate. And so what I have to say to that is just be very mindful of your body language, of your facial expressions, of your tone. We want to have a disposition that is caring and open and honest. We don't want to show the other person that we are shocked, or that we are judging them, or that we think they made a bad decision. Right? And this happens often, especially when we're talking about relationships or maybe things happening. And I'm just giving you an example here. Someone going to a party and being assaulted. Someone who is being supportive will not blame that individual for going to that party, for example. We also need this willingness to learn. We are all human beings, and we all have room for growth. I really believe that. And I feel like I've learned something new every day. All right, another question. When you say being comfortable with the unknown, how can one do this? This is something I struggle with personally as well. Well, it takes practice. So everything that I'm mentioning here, and that's a great question, practice. And practice, don't kid yourself, practice does not make you perfect. Practice makes you more prepared. So I'm going to give an example here. So like Miguel mentioned earlier, I do offer suicide intervention and prevention training. And if I go back 15 years ago, if someone told me that they were thinking of or contemplating ending their life, my response 15 years ago would be very different than it would be right now. So I've really had to focus on watching my tone, my body language. If someone were to say this to me now, I usually pause. I usually think for a second before I say something. And I usually am watching or monitoring my body language? Great question. And there's also a willingness to step into their shoes, like I mentioned earlier. We also want to seek to understand and support the individual and try not to focus on solving the problem. In the moment when someone is experiencing something, especially when it's a traumatic event, let's say we have a child or a friend that has come to us, they're sharing, they're in tears. In that moment, we want to be there for support. So support might look like listening. Support might look like being quiet, being silent. If there's one thing that I have learned over time is that silence can be our absolute best friend. It's uncomfortable, yes. It's awkward sometimes, yes. But sometimes sitting with someone in silence gives us that moment to think, that moment to act, and it also gives the person beside us some space for them to think as well. So don't necessarily jump in and offer solutions, because as human beings, we are great at this. And I'm going to say, we do it out of the goodness from our heart, right? We want to help. People come to us with a problem, we offer a solution right away. But I want you to think about not focusing on solving a problem, and that may come in time, but let's kind of put it over here while we support this person. So are we listening? Are we being empathetic? Does this person need a glass of water? Are we in a safe space? Do we need to go into my office? Should we go out for a walk and get some fresh air? These are some of the things that we should be focusing in on in the moment. I also want us to remember that everyone is going to have different needs.
How can we let traumatic person pursue to get counseling?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one, because I'm sure you already know that in order for someone to get help, they have to want the help. So, I mean, this question comes up a lot in our webinars and in our workshops, because we always have parents, we always have family members, loved ones who want to help someone that they care about, but they're not sure what to do. And I'd say my number one suggestion is to keep having conversations. I will also say we want to be open-minded. We may, for example, pull some resources and show the person, what's available to them. Again, going back to what I mentioned before, giving people choices. If you think someone would benefit from seeing a counselor, a therapist, etc., we want to have those conversations. And we don't want them to be dead-end conversations, right? So you may pull up some resources, you may leave them on the table for the person to see. You may be doing something like a warm transfer. Maybe you can ask the person for permission to call together. Maybe taking someone to an appointment for their first or second time would help them go to that appointment. I also will say that sometimes people don't want to see someone because maybe they think that it's going to cost them money. And I will say that there are many services available out there today, especially since COVID, that are free of charge. The Canadian Mental Health Association, for example, is a national organization. They're across Canada, and they offer mental health supports free of charge. Okay, so I'm going to jump into the next section, which is related to trauma, but it's also, passing the buck of trauma. And we like to call this sliming. And I want you to think about this. And I want you to think about slime. And I want you to think of that all over your body. How would that make you feel? So if we take a look at this quote, helpers who bear witness to many stories of abuse and violence notice that their own beliefs about the world are altered and possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to traumatic experience. So I want you to think about what we talked about when we talked about secondary and vicarious trauma. I also want you to think about stories that you have shared with people and that people have shared with you. Now I want you to think about maybe a time where you shared something with someone and maybe you gave or shared all of the gory detail that went along with the story. When we are passing over traumatic experiences via words, also via other stuff, which I'll get into in a second, we are actually passing over a very bad gift, right? A gift that nobody likes. And we call that sliming. So if we take a look at this image here, I love this. I pulled this from YTV. So when my stepdaughter was younger. So my question to you is, and I'd love to hear from you in the chat box, is have you ever been slimed? Because here's what happens. Some helpers share stories that are gory. So if you're a teacher, a parent, a friend, a spouse, how many times have people shared way too much information with you? Have you ever heard a story where the images cannot be removed from your mind? So sometimes people are sharing stories that are gory, that are traumatic, and to them, because it's something that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, these details are normal to them. Because in a nutshell, they've been desensitized. And what we're starting to notice, what research is showing, that the recipients of this information are being negatively impacted, right? They're being traumatized themselves. I'm going to go a couple of steps further. Have you ever been slimed by watching a TV program? I want you to think about your social media feeds. I want you to think about CNN. I want you to think about shows that you're watching. A lot of the stuff that's on TV, that's on Netflix, that's on social media is very violent and very gory. Some of this stuff sits with us because we are being slimed. So what we're going to talk about, or what I'd like to share with you, are some ideas about not sliming or slowing down sliming with each other.
How can we in the world of online learn avoiding triggering our audience?
Mm-hmm. That's a difficult and interesting question. I really think it comes down to being self-aware. And for first and foremost, I personally know what I can watch and what I cannot. There are things that I will not watch that my husband likes to watch because they are very upsetting to me. I have watched things where I've lost sleep. I remember one time someone posted something about animals. I thought it was a petition because that's what it said. And when I opened it, it was very visual and I couldn't sleep. So I have become very aware of what I can watch, what I can't. And also, when I think about social media, when I think about the news, you may love the news, but do you have to watch it every day, all day long? Can you watch it once a week or once a day instead of, the TV in all the time? So I love this image here because in a nutshell, this is what sliming is, right? We're being attacked with other people's words, the visuals, the thoughts, the negativity. It's affecting us. And like I said, yes, technically we slime each other with our words, but I also want you to take it a couple of steps further. I want you to think about what we watch. I want you to think about who you follow. I want you to think about news. I also want you to think about what you share on social media as well. Because like I said earlier, research is showing us that sharing graphic details spreads traumatic effects. Also, when we debrief disturbing material, whether it's formally or informally, and without asking permission, we are also spreading these traumatic effects. How do we slow down being slimed? We call this low impact disclosure. How do you practice that? So number one is increase self-awareness. So I mentioned this already. And essentially what I mean by this is if you are shared information and it is really upsetting to you, it is disturbing, it has made you cry, you have lost sleep, you are aware of how you are feeling. Why would you want to pass this on to someone else? I also want you to think about what we share with our kids. I can talk about this forever, this part. Our kids are watching way too many things that are violent and gory. If we are self-aware, this is going to help us prepare ourselves for a conversation where we might have to pass information. So let me give you a couple of examples. So let's say we have two teachers that are working with the same student. A situation has arisen, it is traumatic, it is gory, whatever the situation is. Teacher A knows about it. Teacher A is very upset about it. But teacher A has to maybe tell teacher B, maybe teacher B is their supervisor. They got to give them the details. They probably have to fill out a report, et cetera, et cetera. In order to help slow down that process is to give the person in front of you fair warning, right? So if I am going to speak to Miguel and I have to share something with him, I might say something like, Miguel, I experienced something very horrible today. It was very upsetting and disturbing. Are you okay if I share that with you? I am now giving Miguel the opportunity to say, no, thank you. But giving fair warning gives the person an opportunity to say no, to maybe take a break. Miguel might say to me, okay, but I need to grab some lunch. Let's meet up in 15 minutes. And then Miguel will have some time to prepare. Miguel might also say, all right, I'm prepared to listen, but please leave out anything that is violent. Please leave out anything that has to do with X. I also want us to start asking for consent, asking people permission to share. Think about shows that are on TV. You have those trigger warnings that come up, those messages that say this show has scenes of nudity and violence. It's sort of the same thing. You're asking for permission, you're asking for consent. Now, if we turn this around, I want you to think about yourselves. I want you to think about, again, being self-aware. If you are self-aware, then when people start to share with you, whatever it is, because let's be honest, we can go home and our partner, our kids, our friends share stuff with us that we weren't really prepared for. And if we're self-aware, we can stop them in their tracks and say, listen, and I've had to do this with my husband several times, in fact. And I've had to stop him a couple of times. He is not in mental health. He is in construction. And in the last 5 years, a few of his coworkers have passed. And I've had to stop and say, I don't want to know the details. Because for some reason, people love to give all of the gory details. You know, this is how a person died. I think about this often when I teach my suicide intervention training. And I think this is something that everyone should be aware of as well. When someone dies by suicide, why? I want you to ask yourself, why do we need to know how they did it? This is an example of sliming each other. For me, if I'm going to practice low impact disclosure, being self-aware, I'm going to give warning, I'm going to ask for consent, and I might say something like, so-and-so died by suicide, and leave it at that. All of the details that led up to that don't have to be shared. I'm also going to say, because many people ask, well, what if I'm meeting with a supervisor? Or what if I have a report to fill out and I have to? That's okay. There are going to be situations where you have to report, but we still want to be aware. We still want to give fair warning. So your manager or supervisor is going to listen, but you're still giving them warning that it's disturbing, that it's upsetting, and you're asking for consent. So moving forward, ask yourself before you share the next time, is the listener aware that you are about to share graphic details? So if they're not, then that means you need to take a step back, ask for consent, and give them a fair warning. I also want you to ask yourself, is the listener able to control the flow of what you're about to share? So what that means is, do they have the ability to say stop? Do they have the ability to call you out and say, listen, I don't want to hear that. That's too upsetting for me.
In some cases, it helps people to share details in order to help them process it. What can be done in this case?
Okay, so I'm going to go back. I am not saying not to share. I am not saying not to talk. I am asking you to increase your self-awareness. So be aware of how you feel. If you are the person sharing, be aware how you feel. I also am asking, before you share, just give fair warning. So I like to talk, I like to vent, but I have learned over time, and only since I became a trainer in this specific topic, is I will ask my friends, can I talk, right? And there's talking about just our day-to-days and shit that happens, but then there's talking about traumatic events. And that's what I'm stressing here. If it's traumatic, if it's gory, you know, when we're talking about things like sexual assault and abuse, how much information do we really need to pass on? When I talk about sliming, I'm not talking about venting to your friends because you've had a bad day. I'm talking about passing on trauma because we're sharing things that are visual.
Okay. We have a really good one here. It says, what happens when people are hypersensitive and you do not know that, and you don't know what might be triggering to someone?
Well, you know what? We're not going to know. We don't know everyone. I mean, I'm still learning some of the things that upset or trigger me, and we're never going to know what triggers other people. I mean, if you're living with someone, then yes, you learn over time. When we talk about our children, when we talk about the children that we're teaching, you do learn over time, or you can learn. But if we're meeting someone the first time or getting to know someone, we don't know until that situation arises. And maybe an argument happens, or people are, like you said, hypersensitive. I mean, for me, what I am noticing, and everyone's going to be different, but just giving that person space, right? I love the idea of walking away from a situation, not in a bad way, not saying, I don't want to talk to you right now, but giving the person space to breathe. All right, so to wrap things up, I wanted to talk to you about self-care, because as caregivers, we are always looking after other people, and we are last on the list. So as a compassion fatigue trainer, I will say this: what I have learned and what research has shown is the best times of the day to practice self-care is during your transition times. Now, self-care in a nutshell is doing something that you enjoy. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to cost money. It could be going for a walk, talking to a friend. But I want you to think about, and I really want you to try to practice doing something for yourself 15 minutes before you start your workday and 15 minutes after. Just 15 minutes. When we're talking about looking after ourselves, self-care could also mean taking your breaks, eating your lunch, using up your vacation time, talking with your supervisor or manager about what you're experiencing, getting fresh air. If you have benefits, use them up. I know so many people who share with me that they have benefits, they don't use them. They don't use the massages. They don't use the therapy sessions, whatever is involved, they don't use them. I talked about self-awareness, but in a nutshell, to me, self-care is doing what you love. I can tell you to read a book, but you might not like to read, right? Do you like to go to the gym? Do you like to go for walks? Whatever it is that you like to do, do it. Think about things that bring you joy. Exercise is super important, especially when we are experiencing stress and anxiety and even depression. Studies have shown that exercising 3 times a week can have the same effect as an antidepressant. So that just shows us that exercising stimulates the brain. It makes our brain smile. And when our brain is smiling, so are we. I want you to think about also who you can talk to. You know, being a caregiver, looking after other people, hearing and experiencing everything that we do in our lifetime can be exhausting. Do you have anyone that you feel safe enough to talk to? I know I've been talking about how you can support people who have experienced traumatic experiences, but I also want you to remember and give yourself permission to know that as a caregiver, you need that support as well. Right? Yes, Zainab is saying boundaries equal self-care. Absolutely. That's something that I've had to learn along the way. Saying no, having those boundaries is also self-care.